Hey class, how's it going? This is Mr. McDonald here. I just wanted to spend a few minutes reading this Unit 2 homework for Descartes Method 2 with you guys to kind of go through the reasoning Descartes had and figuring out that there was a God that existed. Now, again, this is a primary source from a pretty heavyweight philosopher. Descartes, considered the grandfather of modern philosophy. So, if it seems a little heavy, don't don't be discouraged. But let me read it with you and see if I can help clarify what he's thinking. Um, okay, so this is continued from the last worksheet where Descartes came to the conclusion that he thinks and therefore that proves that he exists, and he kind of discovers an axiom there. The because his method was to actually doubt everything he possibly could. Anything that caused any reason to doubt it, he was just going to doubt it and say it doesn't prove anything, it doesn't exist. But that caused him to realize the one thing that he could be completely certain of is that he exists because he's thinking, and to say that you don't exist is still thinking, and you prove yourself wrong. So let's start out continued from the last worksheet. Said, after that, I considered in general what is needed for a proposition to be true and certain. So he's moving on from the axiom, he thinks, therefore he exists, to now he's talking about epistemology, and he's also talking about truth. How do you know something can be true and certain? Like, what are the mechanisms of it? Like what do you need there? He says, I just had found one that I knew was true and certain. I thought that I ought to know what this certainty consists in. I observed that the proposition, I am thinking, therefore I exist, has nothing about it to me assure that I am speaking the truth when I asserted it, except that I see very clearly that in order to think, it is necessary to exist. So he's saying, logically, it's just super clear, but that's the only thing that he has to go on as far as knowing that what that statement is true and certain. He then goes on to say this. This convinced me that I could take it as a general rule that the things we conceive very vividly and very clearly are all true. But this isn't as powerfully simple a rule as you might think, because there is some difficulty in telling which components are really clear. So, saying it's very clear that he thinks, therefore he exists, it's logical, but it's hard to tell what things are logical and things that aren't. So now he transitions. But remember, he's thinking about the components of what makes things true and ideas now. So he's really deep into epistemology. Okay. So next, I reflected on the fact that I was doubting. So his whole method here is doubt, right? And that consequently, I wasn't wholly perfect, for I saw clearly. So again, he's going back to his, he thinks he's using logic, he's trusting logic, but he sees clearly that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt. So if you know something, or if you're certain of something, that is higher in the level of being or existence than doubt. So he's kind of hierarching those two things. This led me to the question, where did I get my ability to think of something more perfect than I am? So he knows that there's certainty out there, but he's not certain. So how does he get in his mind the idea that certainty is out there, right? Or that there's something that can be more certain? It says, and I drew the obvious conclusion that this ability had to be caused by something that was in fact more perfect than me. To explain why I reached this conclusion, I should first explain why I wasn't exercised about such questions, as it was because I saw nothing in those thoughts that seemed to make them superior to me, i.e., more perfect than I am. So he's giving you his conclusion. He's drawn the conclusion, and he's giving you the conclusion of his argument first, that the idea of perfection came to him from something more perfect than him. And now he's going to say, how come I never thought of this before? He says, there's the couple possible explanations is where he came to the idea that things, where he can think of things more perfect than his own being. Where did that come from? What does he say? Okay, so let me give you an example. Can you think of things more perfect than yourself? Think about all the colors of the rainbow, right? My girl's singing, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. They got this goofy song they sing, right? Can you see in your mind a color other than the colors that we see? You can't. You can't perceive it. It's more perfect or greater than your perception. Now we know that there's other light waves. We know that other animals can see different light waves. So they can see colors that you can't see. Their minds perceive them differently. So we know that from science that there's other light waves, there's UV lights, there's all sorts of things that you could possibly see if your eyes were able to, but you can't. So you can't imagine it. So there's no way to get it into your head. Does that make sense? So how could you imagine something greater than or different than things that you have already experienced? In this case, Descartes is talking about the idea of perfection. If doubt is all there is, and if knowing in part is all there is, you would not conceive of something that knows everything, right? He says, so let's go to these are why he's never questioned this before. One, if the thoughts in question were true, that there's a higher perfection, right? Then they depend or come from some perfection in my own nature. So maybe he has some perfection somewhere within himself that causes him to realize things exist beyond his own nature, right? And if these propositions aren't true, I would have derived them from nothingness, meaning that they could be in me because I had some defect. But neither of these explanations hold for the idea of a being more perfect than me. So how can he consider of a being more perfect than him? Did it come from, like, he's imagining this being and the ideas of truth? Is it from his own nature, or is it coming from nothingness? And he says it's obviously impossible to get it from nothingness. So you don't think of things that don't exist per se because you have no frame of reference. And I couldn't have derived it from myself because the proposition something resulted from and depends on something less perfect than it is just as contradictory as saying something resulted from my nothingness. So it didn't come out of nowhere. And he's also saying you can't get something great from something less perfect than it is. And this is kind of philosophy language and going back to Aristotle style thinking. But again, how can you think of a greater color than the ones that you've already perceived? You can't. It's not possible. So you can't get something resulting on something less perfect than it is. You just can't. You're not going to be able to think of it. So the only possibility left was that the idea had been put into me by something that truly was more perfect than I was. Something indeed having every perfection of which I could have any idea, that is, to explain myself in one word, by God. To this I added that since I knew some perfections that I didn't myself have, I was the only being that existed. Since I knew some perfections that I didn't have myself, I was the only being that existed. And there had to be some other that I wasn't, the only being that existed. So he can think of some perfections that he doesn't have himself. So where does he get that frame of reference? There had to be some other perfect being on which he depends from and acquires everything that he has. There's a relationship here. For if I had existed alone, and this is where we talk about God and his attributes. If he had existed alone himself, not depending on anything else, so that my meager ration of perfections had come from myself, by the same line of reasoning, he says, I could have derived from myself all the remaining perfections that I knew I lacked. So if he thought of a perfect thing from within himself, he should be able to generate all the perfect things that he has thought of. And then he says he himself could be infinite, eternal, unchanging, omniscient, omnipotent. What are these things? These are the characteristics of God. And he says I could have all the perfections that I had been able to discover in God, but he can't. So he knows that those had to have come from somewhere else. For according to the arguments I have just presented, in order to know as much of God's nature as my nature allows me to know, all I needed was to consider for each property of which I had some idea, whether having it was a perfection or not, and I was sure that God doesn't have any of the properties that indicate any imperfection, but that he does have all the others. So whatever you can think of, thinking of the maximum state is thinking about God's properties. Thus I saw that God could not have doubt, inconsistency, sadness, and the like, since I myself would have been very glad to be free of them, which shows that they are imperfections. So you don't want things like doubt, lack of knowledge, sadness, inconsistency. So why do you not want them? Because there's a more perfect state, right? And if he could get rid of him, he would. So but he's basically saying he knows he's not God because he's not perfect. Furthermore, I had ideas of many perceptible bodies, even if I was dreaming, and everything that I saw or imagined was false, I couldn't deny that the ideas of bodies were in my mind. But since I had already recognized very clearly in my own case that intellectual nature is distinct from bodily nature, I observed that if something is comprised of similar elements in any way, that shows it is dependent on something else. So if you can imagine a body in a dream or a person in a dream, that is a representation of a greater thing because the greater thing actually exists. Like if you have a dream of your parents, that's because your parents exist or existed. And so it's better and more great to exist in a higher realm, like to actually be than to not be. And so what he's saying is because he can understand God and kind of think of God in the natural state, like if he's dreaming, that implies that there actually really is a God higher because the actual is greater than the perceptive or the imaginary. It has to come from somewhere. So the idea of your parent in your dream, although it's not real and it's imperfect, came because the parent actually exists. Your understanding that God has to exist with perfect qualities has to be in part because it came from something greater than it, which is the actual real God. I know it's mind boggling, but it's fun. So, if a thing is composed of similar elements in any way, it shows that it is dependent on something else, and that dependence is obviously a defect. I concluded that it couldn't be a perfection in God to be composed of these two natures, the intellectual and the bodily, and consequently, he was not composed of them. So, he's saying God does not have two natures. And so that if there were bodies in the world or any intelligence or any other natures that weren't wholly perfect, their being must depend on God's power in such a way they couldn't stay in existence for a single moment without him. Because if God didn't exist, you wouldn't have the perception of him. If people didn't exist, you wouldn't have them in your imagination at all. So for them to exist, your imagination depends on them existing. All right. Hopefully that helped. I know it's confusing and fun. Um, but there you have it. That's the best I could do for you guys. You should be able to answer the questions based on that. Note that he is discussing epistemology. He's using epistemology and logic and philosophy in general to come to theological conclusions. All right, that's the end of the exercise. I'm not grading you guys harshly on this. I just want you to try. I want you to annotate it, look up summaries, do what you got to do. But just do your best on it and keep the gears turning, and I'll see you guys in class.